lands in prison, and they declare their innocence. Although they have come through the criminal justice system, there are some who believe that the criminal justice system in our country does not, there's some that believe that it's perfect. And one thing is very, very clear, and that is that one of the things that will get us as close to perfection as we can get is that if the people that we trust, such as FBI agents and others and judges, it is important that they do their job in an honest and truthful manner, because I think that's what leads to the trust of the public. And that leads me to my first question. You know, in reading your testimony, Mr. Garrow, you seem to have kind words about John Durham, the prosecutor heading up the Justice Department task force.
I do.
Why is that, sir?
He is the first prosecutor, in my opinion, that I have met in the entire investigation of this case for over 26 years that had as his motive in this case to let the truth come out, and that it would have been very easy for him, Mr. Congressman, to have thrown away these documents, and that the FBI agents that were working for him found these documents, and they found them because they were misfiled in other files, Mr. Congressman, and they were in the Boston office. All of the regular files had already been destroyed at that time, Mr. Congressman. This was all done, Mr. Congressman. If you throw away the evidence, it can't come back to haunt you. The only problem is that it had been misfiled, and they spent hours and days and weeks and months poring over these documents to give me those documents. And that's why we say, Mr. Congressman, that we still have the greatest justice system in the world. And when you have a person like John Durham, and you have a person like Judge Mark Wolf in the federal court who took on the investigation here of informants back in Boston, they're heroes. They're the ones that have fought the system, and they have let come out the evidence that we have. And it makes us feel good because we don't paint all the FBI with the same brush, and we say we need them. But Don, when you break the sacred oath and trust, when I represent defendants in court and it's a public official, the first thing that the prosecutor says is, because he was a public official and he broke his sacred trust, we throw the book at him. But conversely, in this case, no book has been thrown at any of the federal officials.
Do you think the book should be thrown at him?
Absolutely. For those that are guilty, for those that took part in this, because how can anybody be so inhuman? Because we wanted, Mr. Chairman, to see how much this affected this family. That's what people don't want you to see, Mr. Congressman. And that's why this is difficult for the three of us. We're not here for publicity. I don't practice criminal law. I'm not looking to get referral cases. But we're here when we got first approached by Mr. Wilson, who I have the deepest respect for, and his staff, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, and the work and the hours that they've put into this. We knew that sooner or later this is important to say. And this has never been about money, power, prestige. Those that know me know that I'm not like that. But if we can help you out, we have pledged that we will be here for you at any time. I said that I would give and help Mr. Wilson, Mr. Yeager behind the scenes on anything that your staff wants, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be here for you all the time.
Mr. Garrow, your client was facing the death penalty. Is that what you said?
Yes, sir, that's true.
And Ms. Salvati, how did that affect you?
I became numb. Like you know, I just couldn't believe it, that our lives could be so shattered with all this here, and you know, it was devastating. It was just devastating. You get yourself like in a state, and when the verdict came in, and I just, you know, I had like a horrible night that night, especially when the verdict came in. My children were my first priority. I went to get them from school, you know, because I don't want them to hear nothing in the street. So I took them home and I told them what had happened to, you know, Dad. We call him Dad. And he said, I said, you're going to hear a few things, you're going to hear things in the paper, and, families talk when they go home, you know how people are. And so I try to comfort them and try to, not tell them more than what I had to because they were little, especially the 4-year-old. And we got through that. The very next day, my husband had the chaplain call me, and he wanted to see me right away. So we needed that bonding between us to go through this sorrow, this heartache together. All I could think of him was the night before being shackled in jail. I had no concept of what jail was about or how anything was. And, like we needed each other too, but yet to be there for each other, and we had that bonding with us all the time.
Mr. Chairman, just one quick statement. I just want to express to you and your husband, something that Mr. Garrow said. We do have an outstanding system of justice. It does fail. We have a lot of great people in our justice system. But I hope and I pray that God will give you the strength and the courage to continue on. You both have held up tremendously. I mean, a lot of people would not have held up under these circumstances, and I thank God for you and for your lives, and certainly you'll be in my prayers.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Cummins. Before I yield to Mr. Barr, one of the things that I will ask our legal counsel and our staff to investigate is whether or not there were some other injustices done as well. I understand that Mr. Barbosa testified in some other criminal trials and people were sent to jail. I don't know if anybody was sent to death or not, but we're going to investigate that as well. And so what you're telling us here today is not going to just reflect on the injustice done to the Salvatis, but also we're going to look at other things as well. Mr. Barr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could the staff prepare Exhibits 15, 8, and 7, please? Begin with 15. Counsel, when I first started learning about this case from counsel and from the chairman and from Mr. Shays, probably as most people, I was skeptical. It reads like a novel. And then as you get into it, you say, well, yeah, maybe this sort of stuff did happen, but certainly the head of the FBI didn't know about it. He would have stopped it. But the fact of the matter is that there appears to be documentation that indicates very clearly that the director of the FBI, Mr. Hoover, knew exactly what was going on, and that's very, very disturbing as a former U.S. attorney, as a citizen. You don't have to be a former U.S. attorney or an attorney to be disturbed by that. It's disturbing deeply as a citizen. Document exhibit number 15 is an Airtel. These are back in the days before all the technology. We didn't have emails and so forth. Dated the 19th of March of 1965, which was, I think, about a week after the Deegan murder. And that document is to Director FBI. In your knowledge, which is certainly extensive, my understanding is that Mr. Hoover kept very close tabs on what happened in the FBI.
He was getting information on a weekly basis, Mr. Congressman, on exactly what was happening back in Boston, because Boston in the 1960s was going through a gang war, and there were approximately 50 to 60 people who got killed, and they weren't able to get any convictions on a lot of the murders, and he wanted to be on top of everything that was happening in the Boston area during that period of time. So he was being informed on a weekly basis. This is only one of the documents that was left as misfiled. Other documents that Mr. Durham believes he's either been destroyed or may even be around in other places have not surfaced yet. But there are documents also, Mr. Congressman, that show that the director knew exactly what was going on. What happened here, if I can, Mr. Congressman, that in March of 1965, if I could do just a little chronology of this, in February of 1965, Stephen the Rifleman Fleming had been targeted as a top echelon informant. On March 9th of 1965, his brother was being targeted as an informant. On March 10th...
When you say targeted as an informant, you mean by the FBI?
Yes, absolutely. Then on March 10th, they received information that Deegan and Barboza might be going to kill Teddy Deegan. On March 12th, Teddy Deegan was killed. On March 13th, Vincent Fleming told the same informant that he and Joe Barboza killed Teddy Deegan the night before with 3 other guys, told them how it happened, how they were going to get in and do the B&E, how it happened, who was there, who did what, and they did a very sloppy job. On March 19th, all this information now is given to the director of the FBI. Now what happens is now you have to go 2.5 years later, because around March, April, or May of 1967, Barboza becomes a witness for the federal and state governments on various defendants that I've talked about previously. Now, when Barboza is willing to take down and give false and perjurious statements on first-degree murder cases, and it's all uncorroborated testimony, now, in my opinion, is that happens now is between March, April, of May of 1967 and October 25th of 1967, when the indictments came down as a result of Barboza's testimony on October 25th, the previous information just got in the way of the prosecution of these 3 cases. So now they let Barboza tell another story. No one's ever going to find out about these documents because we're going to bury the documents and destroy them.
In your view, are there sufficient checks and balances and access to information now that weren't available back in the 1960s?
No.
So that you would have a confidence level that this sort of thing could not happen?
No, I
again?
have no confidence right now that that won't happen, because this has been happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the 90s. It's occurring right up today, Mr. Congressman, because there's still a denial at the FBI in Boston that anything was wrong. They've done nothing wrong.
But I don't mean just in this case. In other cases, I mean, we have additional safeguards that have been put in place both statutorily as well as in guidelines for the use of informants, as well as court decisions that have come down in the intervening decades. Do you have a confidence level that with all of those safeguards that we have in place now, that this sort of thing could not happen again?
None whatsoever.
Do you have some recommendations for us on specific steps that could be taken to help raise your comfort level?
I think that that should be done, Mr. Congressman, with the defense bar. When everybody makes guidelines determining what's going to happen within the FBI or the government, they go to government. They don't go to the criminal defense bar. I think that the criminal defense bar, as over here, the 2 of the finest criminal defense lawyers that there are in the country, I think that they ought to be sitting down around the country and determining what legislation is necessary. I don't practice criminal law anymore, Mr. Congressman, and other than for the Joe Salvati case for all these years. So I'm not maybe the best person in the world to tell you how to do that, but I know that the Massachusetts Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers would make themselves very available to sit down and talk either with you or the committee to find what can be done with legislation and checks and balances to make sure that something like this, Mr. Chairman, would never happen again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's really troubling to think that this is continuing to go on. As I understand it, the assistant U.S. attorney up there, they're working on this right now to dig out all the dirt that they possibly can. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Attorney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is not out of lack of respect that I keep believing, and I apologize for that. Like Mr. Waxman, I have another committee on education that's marking up a bill.
We understand that, Mr. Congressman. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I would like to give my time to Mr. Delahunt, who I know is prepared to go forward on that at this time, and so I would yield to Mr. Delahunt.
Mr. Delahunt?
Yes, thank you. I thank my colleague from Massachusetts for yielding, and I thank the chair for, again, for allowing us to participate. Mr. Garrow, you stated that it is your belief that the informant alluded to in the various reports that have come to your attention, the report by the FBI by a Special Agent Paul Rico, a Chelsea Police Department report authored by a Captain or Lieutenant Evans, and a Boston police report authored by one William Stewart, a state police report authored by a Lieutenant Cass, refer to the same individual when they reference an informant. Is that correct?
No, no, I say that there are several different informants, Mr. Congressman. On the Chelsea Police Report, that is one informant. The informants on the FBI documents that were handed to me by Mr. Durham, that's a second informant, in my opinion. And in the documents that were provided on the others, I think that in the Detective Richard Cass's report from the state police, that he had further information that no one else had, and I say that there was
Okay,
another informant.
let me go back then again. I know you mentioned the name of one Stephen Fleming, and it's your belief that he was the informant referred to in the report by Special Agent Paul Rico.
That is my opinion.
You know, Mr. Chairman, are you aware of any documents or any reports whatsoever that exist that reveals the name of that informant?
No, I do not. As a matter of fact, Mr. Durham, in his investigation, was unable to find that because the informant documents had already been destroyed.
Well, that answers my question, because I was going to request the chair of this particular committee to inquire of the FBI to reveal the name of that particular informant.
Mr. Congressman, though, I would say this to you, that I wish you would still make that request, because I have a feeling that there's still information
Well, then I
that's
will,
around.
then I will make that request.
It's a
Because I think it's an excellent
and
request.
I yield to the chair.
If the gentleman will yield, and I thank you for yielding, we certainly will. We'll contact the head of the current acting head of the FBI and whoever his successor is, and we'll ask for any documents that pertain to this investigation and what's going on up in Boston.
I think that's an excellent
Thank you
point,
for the question.
Mr. Congressman.
I would like to, I just simply can't imagine any basis in terms of what has gone on in Boston pursuant to the proceedings presided over by Judge Wolf, why the name of that particular informant cannot be revealed, because it's simply my opinion that that would remove some of the mystery surrounding the case against Mr. Salvati. We spoke, as I indicated earlier last Saturday, regarding the case of Mr. Salvati, and I took a particular interest in your explanation of the efforts that you made to seek a commutation in behalf of Mr. Salvati. Could you just repeat them once more for members of the panel? And maybe, Mr. Garrow, you could start with explaining to members of the panel what the commutation process is and how one proceeds and its significance in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. If you could start there, please.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Congressman. In Massachusetts, when you are convicted of murder in the first degree, you have no right to parole. The only way that you have a right to parole is if you receive a commutation. And a commutation is considered to be an extraordinary legal remedy. In order to get a commutation, 3 votes have to be taken. One by the parole board sitting as the advisory board of pardons, the second vote by the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the third by the governor's council, not legal council, the governor's council, a duly elected body. The 3 of those votes have to be situated so that for you to get a commutation. It is not easy to obtain. So that I had filed for a commutation in '86, but I was told by the then current chairman of the parole board that they weren't going to hold the hearing. Now, in granting, Mr. Chairman, a commutation hearing in the Commonwealth of Mass by a parole board, that means that they are very seriously contemplating giving you your commutation, because they don't do it to raise the hopes of an inmate that you're going to get out. They don't do that. So it's Mr. Salvati's really to lose, 95% for him to win it, 5% for him not to win it. The chairman of the parole board said to me in 1986 that he was contacted by the FBI, that they were doing an investigation, that Salvati was part of it, and that he was going to get indicted.
Let me just repeat that slowly. You were contacted, or the chair of the Massachusetts Parole Board was contacted by the FBI indicating that they were conducting an investigation that implicated Mr. Salvati.
That is correct, Mr. Congressman.
Proceed, please. Do you know the
No.
name of the FBI agent?
No, I
that
do
con-
not. No, I do not.
Could you identify the individual on the Massachusetts Parole Board who,
Yes, Jim Curran, who's now currently a judge out in the western part of the state.
and Mr. Curran was the chair at the time,
Yes, sir.
and he indicated,
If the gentleman would yield, we will contact the judge, and we will ask who the FBI agent was that informed him there was an ongoing investigation.
Thank you, Mr.
I thank the chair.
Chairman.
Would you proceed,
Thank you.
Mr. Garrow?
I was very well known to the parole board because I used to knock on the doors all the time for many years. As a matter of fact, when they heard I was in the building, they would say, "Hey, Victor, come on in and have a cup of coffee with us," because I believe that I've always conducted myself as a gentleman. I believe I was always conducted my representation of Mr. Salvati always on an upper level.
But what happened to that investigation, Mr. Garrow?
Nothing.
Nothing.
After 3 years,
After 3 years, nothing happened.
that is correct, Mr.
And what did you do then, Mr. Garrow?
I went to Mr. Curran and I said, "They are trying to prevent you from ever having a hearing on Mr. Salvati."
And what did Mr. Curran say to you?
He said, "You're right, we're going to hold a hearing."
And did he hold a hearing?
Yes, they did, sir.
And what was the conclusion of that hearing?
It was held in August of 1989, and at a date that I still don't know, Mr. Congressman, they voted unanimously for the parole.
Mr. Garrow, how many members on the parole board?
At that time, I had 5 members that were present at the
And
hearing.
each and every one of them voted in favor of commuting the first-degree murder sentence of Mr. Salvati, and that was in 1989.
I don't know the date.
Okay, you don't know the
It's
date.
always been hidden for me because
It's been
of,
hidden from you.
and I will explain
Again,
that.
I would hope that the chair of this particular committee would request the documents from the Massachusetts Parole Board relative to when that unanimous vote was taken. Proceed, Mr. Garrow.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. At that time, when I received a phone call from a member of the parole board who said to me, "Mr. Garrow, I have some good news and bad news for you. You've received a unanimous vote of the parole board, but the documents are not going to be placed on Governor Dukakis's desk." And I said, "Can you tell me why?" He said, because of the Willie Horton scandal that had happened and other matters, that they really don't want to deal with your commutation. And that was a major blow to us, Mr. Congressman, because I then had to meet with my client, Mr. Salvati, and his wife and 4 children, because at that
Are
time...
you aware of any communication between the then Governor Dukakis's office and the chair of the parole board regarding concern about the Willie Horton case?
Only that what I was told by the parole board themselves.
Could you give, at some point in time, could you give the names of those
Yes,
individuals
I'll be glad to give that
this
to you at
committee?
appropriate time, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Congressman.
And what happened, then, Mr. Garrow? If I can indulge the chair for an additional time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What happened then,
Let me just
Mr.
say, I'm happy to yield the gentleman my 5 minutes. I'll have my
Well,
shot in.
we'll give you time. Without objection, we'll let
There's a
Mr.
particular
Delaware.
line of question I want to
You just
pursue.
stay right at it, sir.
Mr. Garrow, please.
We had a very difficult decision, Mr. Congressman, as you well know, that if I filed a motion for a new trial, I'd lose my unanimous vote of the parole board. And knowing the history here of the judicial handling of these cases, I told them, I says, we're not going to overturn this case.
So that's when you made the decision not to pursue the motion for a new trial?
That is correct.
Fine.
We gave that up because we had a unanimous vote of the parole board, and we said, let's keep what we have. Why go into waters where we don't know what we're going to get?
Right.
1992, in came Governor Weld.
Right.
On January 20th of 1993, Mr. Salvati's commutation was turned down by Governor Weld.
And what was the reason expressed by the then governor for rejecting the recommendation, the unanimous recommendation of the parole board?
My client's long and involved criminal record.
Can you relate to us how long and involved Mr. Salvati's criminal record was?
A conviction in 1956 for breaking and entering the possession of a burglarious implement, and a couple of traffic tickets.
You referenced earlier that one Jack Zalkine was the prosecutor in the case against Mr. Salvati.
That is correct.
And during our conversation last Saturday, I requested any documents that you might have relative to this commutation process.
That you did, sir.
And I have a bunch of them here, and I will ask the chair to submit them. And if I, again...
Without objection.
Back on March 12th of 1979, Mr. Garrow, did you receive a letter from Jack Zalkine?
Yes, I did.
And if you could read, if you have it before you, if you could read the second paragraph for the benefit of the committee, please.
Surely. This is a letter dated March 12, 1979, to whom it may concern Ray Joseph Salvati. Second paragraph. During the investigation of this case, prior similar activities by Mr. Salvati never came to my attention, and it was my belief at that time that it was Mr. Salvati's first serious criminal involvement.
Can you repeat that again for the benefit of the panel?
It was my belief at that time that it was Mr. Salvati's first serious criminal involvement.
And that was a letter dated to you on March 12th of 1979.
That is correct, Mr. Congressman.
And back in 1979, did you also receive a communication from a Frank Walsh?
Yes, I did.
Could you inform the panel who Mr. Walsh is?
Mr. Walsh was a detective in the Boston Police Department assigned to organize crime activities and homicides, and he was involved in the investigation and arrest of Joseph Salvati.
Okay, referring, if you have before you, a letter from Mr. Walsh dated March 15th, 1979, and if you would refer to the third paragraph, could you read it to the committee?
Certainly, Mr. Congressman. During my investigations prior to his indictment, subsequent sentencing, and to this date, I have never become aware that Mr. Salvati has been even remotely connected with firearms or physical violence.
Thank you. And both of these letters, and there were subsequent letters similar in nature, is that a fair statement?
That's a very fair statement.
Recommended, from the prosecutor and the investigator, recommended a commutation for Mr. Salvati. Is that accurate?
That is very accurate.
And yet we have the then governor of Massachusetts in 1992 making a statement that it was because of his long criminal history, and I also remember reading something about his association with organized crime. Is that?
That was part of it also, yes, Mr. That was in 93, January 20th, 1993.
Did you ever have any communication with anyone from Governor Wells' office?
No, I was like persona non grata. No one would talk to me.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that anybody from the Federal Bureau of Investigation would have communicated with the governor's office relative to the commutation of Mr. Salvati?
If may I, may I, Mr. Congressman, do that with an old evidence trick that we were once taught in law school, that when it snows during the night and you wake up the next morning and you see footprints around the building, I can't tell you who the footprints belong to you, but I can tell you that the footprints are there, and the footprints are all there that no doubt that Governor Weld was talked to.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I think this is important because I know Governor Weldon, he probably relied on some staff people for this. Do you know who at the governor's office would have been contacted about this?
No idea.
You have any idea?
Mr. Chairman?
We will contact former Governor Weld and ask him who gave him that information.
I think that is very important, because I presume, given what I've read in newspaper reports, that the FBI, and even today in the special agent in charge of the FBI office, one Charles Prouty, has indicated that while they had this information, they did transmit it to local authorities. It would seem that, at least in terms of Mr. Prouty's statements, that it's his opinion that that terminated any obligation that the FBI had relative to providing this exculpatory information about Mr. Salvati. But it's clearly different if the FBI took an active role and involvement in impeding the process of the commutation of Mr. Salvati, extending those years from maybe 10 or 15 years that were clearly a significant injustice to some 30 years. It's disgraceful, and I hope the chair proceeds to examine that matter very closely. Thank you for the time.
Mr. Congressman and Mr. Chairman, may I make just one comment on it? Maybe you are now beginning to get the flavor of what I was going through all of these years, because no one was listening.
Well, we're listening, and we will contact Governor Weld to find out what transpired. Mr. Shays?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I hope Mr. Delahunt continues to participate in these hearings that we'll be having. I have a close friend named Austin McGuigan, who was the chief state's attorney in Connecticut, and 20 years ago he predicted to me that someday there would be a story about the corruption that existed in the FBI operation in New England. And part of what motivated him to say that was that he was questioning witnesses that were being, in dealing with the world highlight, and they were being murdered. And he was puzzled by the fact that so many retired FBI agents were working for organized crime in Connecticut. I have such a difficult time understanding the early stages of this. And Mr. Salvati, I need to ask you a question or two, and I'm sure I'll understand it after you tell me. But first, was this trial a jury trial, or was it a trial by a judge?
Jury trial.
Jury trial.
Yes.
And why was it that, was it pointed out that the witness had an incredible, despicable record? Was it made clear to the jury?
Yes, and they used that to say that you need the bad guy to catch the bad guy.
Okay. Didn't you have an alibi?
No, I did not.
Explain that to me. I mean,
Well,
you were somewhere.
But I don't know where I was that night,
Okay, and that is because
because I wasn't there. Why would I need
understand
an
that,
alibi?
but I guess what you don't have is what I have. I have a Franklin planner, and I can tell you where I was. But obviously, we didn't have Franklin planners then, and you didn't have it. But I'm smiling just because I'm so incredulous. Is this because there was such a time frame between? Would it be like asking me what I did
2.5 years
Two and a half
earlier.
years ago.
So I
yes.
would have had to identify 2.5 years now, what I did 2.5 years earlier on a particular day.
Right.
And that's the Mr. Congressman, and that's what is so unbelievable, is that Joe Salvati did not invent an alibi and did not create an alibi,
He didn't
and
know?
just said, look, I wasn't there. I don't know where I was, but I certainly wasn't there because I had nothing to do with that
Well,
situation.
You know, the problem for me is that someone who I know, this is causing me.
Would the gentleman yield real
Yeah, I
briefly?
mean, it just makes me wonder about so many things I've read and heard. And so, yeah.
Let me just ask you one question that needs to be asked, but I hope it's not too uncomfortable for you. But in your first trial, there were a number of defendants along with you, and others who were innocent of this crime as well as you. And we've been told that, the head of the mafia up there paid the legal expenses for everybody that was involved in that case. Is that correct?
No, it's not.
Who paid for your legal expenses?
I
in that
paid
trial?
whatever I had saved, and they ran a benefit for me, and that was it.
Oh, so you paid for your own legal expenses?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, the information I had was erroneous then. Mr. Shays, thank you.
I'd love it if
Excuse
we
me.
would,
I think
yes.
Ms. Salvati.
I can attest to that because we did a fundraising for him in the community, and the little money that we had, we put towards legal counsel for him, and he didn't have the best.
Well,
so-
thank you very much, Mr. Shays. Thank you.
I'd love to make reference to Exhibit 11, which Mr. LaCharette had shown earlier. I'd love to have you turn, I'd like it on the third page, and it's the third to last paragraph. Just explain to me first, Mr. Garrow, what this exhibit is. This is, my understanding, this is the Police Department of Chelsea's statement by the officer, Lieutenant Thomas Evans, of what he saw when he investigated this crime.
What this document represents, Mr. Congressman, is the investigation done by Lieutenant Evans and his partner, Bill Moore, on the night of the murder, the next day of the murder, and what they observed and what they found out from all different sources.
And the Chelsea Police Department is a small police department? I
Not
mean,
that small,
is
good
it-
size.
How big is the town, community of Chelsea?
I can't tell you.
Is it part of Boston? I'm sure.
Yes, it's a suburb of Boston.
It's a suburb, but it's its own entity. It's its own.
Entity, yes, it
It's
is.
its own community. But this was the report of the officer who was investigating.
That's
Do you have your
correct.
permission to proceed, Mr. Chairman? This is a document that was not made available to the prosecutor or the defendant?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, and this is a document that at one time people denied even existed?
That is correct.
What I don't understand, though, is Mr. Lieutenant Evans knew it existed because he wrote it.
That's correct.
So when Mr. Evans says in this paragraph, excuse me, he's not Mr. Evans, he's Lieutenant Evans, I received information from Captain Renfrew. Did he work in the department?
Yes, he was.
Okay. That an informant of his had contacted him and told him that French had received a telephone call at the ebb tide at 9 p.m. on March 12, 65. And after a short conversation, he left the cafe with the following men. And then it lists 6 people: Joseph Barbosa, Ronald Caseso, Vincent Fleming, Francis Mbuglia, Romero Martin, and Nicky Femia, and a man by the name of Freddie, who is about 40 years old and said to be a, quote, strong man, end of quote. They are said to have returned at 11 p.m., and Martin was alleged to have said to French, "We nailed him." Now, this was actually in a police document.
That is correct.
What I don't understand is there are more than one person who's aware of this document.
Correct.
Okay. Who did you ask for this document, and who denied it existed?
Well, first of all, I obtained a copy of this document, Mr. Congressman, about 3 weeks before the beginning of the commutation hearing in August of 1989.
So in August of 1989.
I received it about 3 weeks before.
Okay. So, and where did you receive it from?
I would rather not disclose that.
So it's,
Mr.
but
Congressman.
was it in the possession of the Chelsea Police Department?
That's an interesting story, if I could answer that, Mr. Congressman. When I had obtained a copy of this document, I used it on the commutation hearing of Mr. Salvati. And when Governor Weld had denied the commutation back on January 20th of 93, because of his long criminal record, et cetera, I said I needed someone in the press to start helping me. And I found a wonderful ally who's done a wonderful job, Dan Ray, who's here today in Chambers. And Dan has done wonderful investigative reporting in the case also. And when I showed him the report in March of 1993, He then went about and did his own investigation also, and he went to the Chelsea Police Department and said, "Do you have an old file on the Deegan murder case?" And they said, "I'll go look for one." Lo and behold, they came back with a folder. The first document he opens up is the original of this document. So that the original of this document was in a small file folder on the Deegan murder case.
I thought you said they didn't have the document.
That's what they said.
Well, they is what, someone?
If what you're being confused about, and I know you're not confused, is this: are you saying the Chelsea Police Department conspired with the FBI in this case? The answer is yes. Do I think that the Boston Police Department conspired with the FBI office in this case? Yes, I do. Do I believe that certain police officers associated and did things with the FBI concerning this case? The answer is yes. Because for this document to come out, Congressman, then there would be coming out information about informants.
But why weren't you able to get the document when someone from the press was able to get the document? Explain that to me.
No one ever looked at it at that time. No, you have to understand, Congressman, no one wanted to talk about this case.
So, you mean, in other words, when you asked, they didn't even bother to look?
On when was that,
You
Congressman?
asked-
I wasn't on the trial counsel.
No,
I
didn't you ask for this document earlier?
No.
Okay,
No,
okay.
no, I obtained a copy of it 3 weeks before my commutation hearing, and that's when I did my
Let
own.
me, I'm sorry, if I just make sure I am confused, so you're
Not
trying
a
to say
problem.
I'm not, but I am.
I'm sorry I'm confusing
No,
you.
you're not, it's not your fault. I just want to know this. You would have clearly have gone to the Chelsea Police Department to ask for any records they had. You did that before, correct?
There were no documents that were ever turned over to me from the Chelsea Police Department having anything to do with Salvati's case.
Okay, and you did ask for it?
The lawyers had asked for it, there were motions filed,
Okay.
and there were requests made.
Okay.
It would almost seem, Mr. Congressman, wouldn't it, that maybe somebody had been keeping that document hidden for a lot of years, and then
But
maybe
what
had
I kind of
slipped
hear
it.
you saying is if you didn't specifically ask for it, it didn't come into your possession, and you didn't feel you had to ask for it, you would have thought it would have been given to you. And it just so happens that someone asked for this document and they were handed it.
And what happened, though, Mr. Congressman, in reading the 8,000 pages of transcript,
Right.
you would come to find out that all the reports they had, they said were in evidence.
Right, so you
This
would-
was an additional
I hear you.
document.
I hear you. So this was something totally different.
That is correct, out of the blue.
Okay, well,
That's why I said, Mr. Congressman, the most important document that I ever received in this case was this hidden Chelsea police report, because that showed who the real
but-
killers
but-
were.
yeah, just
Sure.
to finish, what strikes me as amazing, though, is that Mr. Lieutenant Evans somehow didn't feel compelled to come forward, but also Captain Renfrew. Have you ever spoken to either one? I believe
Captain
that
Renfrew would not speak to me.
he would not speak to you.
That is correct.
So, I mean, and he's living today?
He died.
Okay. And evidently, Lieutenant Evans is not in...
He passed away.
Okay. Wow. Well, I will say to you, all three of you, that I rejoice in the fact, Mr. Salvati, that you're out, and Mrs. Salvati, that you get to hug your husband without anyone watching. But I wonder now, you know, who else is like you, Mr. Salvati, who's still there, and maybe he doesn't have a lawyer like Mr. Garrow. And I wonder how many people have died in prison who were in your circumstance and were not able to celebrate their being let out.
More than a few, Mr. Congressman, more than a few.
Thank you.
Let me just say to my colleague, we will, as far as we can, I mean, we can't cover every case that took place up in the Boston area, but any case involving Barboza and some of those others, we're going to try to get information. If we find there are similar circumstances, we'll look into them. Mr. Meehan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding these hearings, this hearing. This is a critically important case. The revelations about the relationship between the Boston FBI agents and Boston area underworld figures are obviously a matter of concern to us in Massachusetts, but really to the entire country. And to get back to what Congressman Shays has just indicated. This isn't just a question of what happened in this case, or just what happened in a series of cases, but a culture in the FBI that may be taking place, or have taken place, not only in Boston, but throughout the country. I want to go quickly to this 1993 report. You had indicated that WBZ's Dan Ray had a police report that was found in a file in 1993.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Where had it been all these years?
Don't know.
Does anyone know?
You'd probably have to ask somebody in the Chelsea Police Department, Mr. Congressman.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. Congressman Frank and Delahunt and I appreciate the fact that we can participate here. We had called for congressional hearings not because we wanted to cripple the FBI. We all have respect for what the FBI does on a daily basis to protect people from violence and terrorism and fraud. But I think at a minimum, we want to find out the truth, because sunlight and accountability ultimately prevent a repeat of the mistakes that have severely tarnished the FBI here. And we also want the truth to come out so that Mr. Salvati and others whose lives have been shattered at least could be heard. And they deserve so much more than that, but at a minimum they deserve to be heard. Actually, I called for hearings as far back as the summer of 1998, when the relationship between the FBI agents and two particular Boston area gangsters were revealed. And in general, this isn't a new story for those of us from Boston, but the revelations that have been leaking out over the 4 or 5 years, with Judge Wolf's 260-page opinion being, from my perspective, a watershed event in pulling back the curtains of decades of the incestuous relationship between the agents and the informants and the destructive consequences. I didn't know much or focus back in the summer of 1998 the most tragic part of this story, the most tragic thing of all, and it's the one that we hear today. And it's hard to believe that this could happen in America. It is hard to believe that FBI agents could know of a murder in the making and not stop it from happening. It's hard to believe that FBI agents could know a man was innocent of a crime, yet allow him to be jailed for what was to be life. We've heard about the process with the governor, first Governor Dukakis and Governor Weld, and to allow him to be stripped from his family, his life, his liberty. And the FBI says that they were forthcoming. They say they didn't conceal information indicating Mr. Salvati's innocence, and they didn't attempt to frame anybody. Well, there's plenty of dispute here over how the FBI handled the information it received in this case, the information exonerating Mr. Salvati. But one way or the other, I think that we deserve to better than we didn't attempt to frame anyone. It's the FBI's job to protect us, and obviously it failed miserably here. Ultimately, we can never undo the pain and suffering inflicted in this case. At least we can offer apologies. We can ensure that this doesn't happen again, and one of the issues is these so-called guidelines that have been, the Justice Department has reported. But I can't help but look back to early in the Ford administration. I think it was Attorney General Levy went through a process of guidelines at that time, but they didn't seem to have much of an effect here. The guidelines didn't affect the culture of the FBI. I would add, Mr. Chairman, that at the time, in the early 70s, it was a congressional hearing shedding light on that process of guidelines that resulted in getting the new guidelines and resulted in putting some guidelines that at least took into account. So that's why these hearings are so critical, Mr. Chairman. But I wonder if you have a perspective, Mr. Garrow, as to how you change this culture. It's one thing to take guidelines and to have hearings and continue. I'm happy to hear the chairman's going to continue this process and get information, get to the bottom of it. How do you change the culture, notwithstanding the attempt to have guidelines?
I don't think you can just do it by guidelines. I think there has to be some checks and balances that are in there. And what I had offered earlier, Mr. Congressman, was this, is that whenever guidelines or anything comes down of the government doing its own checks and balances, that never works. And what happens is we have in Massachusetts a wonderful organization called the Mass Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And it would seem to me, Mr. Congressman, that when and if this committee, or when and if your committee into the future investigates further, that some of the more practicing attorneys, because I don't practice criminal law anymore, Mr. Congressman, and I'm not looking to do this to
Burnt
get,
out, the case burnt you out, huh?
and not looking for more business like this. But there are, Mr. Bolero is here, Mr. Bailey is here. There are wonderful criminal defense lawyers to, actually, they're the ones that should be part of any process into the future, because that's where the tire meets the road. They're out there every day fighting the system. And we were told in law school that the system has to work for the very worst of us to work for the very best of us.
I was detained earlier. You think this case has been frustrating. I was at a meeting. We're trying to get campaign finance reform passed, and I'm reminded of the frustrations trying to do that, a lot of the frustrations you've had. But I want to ask you, the Supreme Court in Brady versus Maryland, Riverio versus United States, held that government had certain obligations to disclose exculpatory information to defendants in criminal cases. Isn't that right?
Absolutely.
And could you explain in general terms what that means?
What it means in general sense is that the government is a human being. It just doesn't look to convict, it looks for justice. What you're looking for, there shouldn't even have to be a rule of law like Brady. If there's a situation and you have evidence of a person who's being innocent, and you're going to put him to death in the electric chair, you would think that human rights and human decency, forgetting the law, would make the government want to comply with that. But as we know, they didn't obey the law. They didn't obey their conscience. It was the truth be damned, full-blown ahead for convictions only.
In the Riverio case, the court stated specifically where the disclosure of an informer's identity or the contents of his communication is relevant and helpful to the defense of an accused, or is essential in a fair determination of a case, the information must be disclosed or the case must be dismissed. Now, is that your understanding what the law was at the time of Mr. Salvati's trial?
That was a 1959 Supreme Court of the United States decision. I had used it successfully many times in the past. I don't have to tell Mr. Bolero or any of the good criminal defense lawyers that were involved in the Deegan murder case at the time. They knew all about those laws. That's the reason why, Mr. Congressman, that it was withheld from them that there were informants. Because under Roviaro, the law is that if you make a demand for an informant during trial and you can show it can be relevant and helpful, you're going to get the name of that informant 95 to 99% of the time. And if the government doesn't give it to you, the charges are dismissed. Can you imagine how the chicanery was going on in the Boston office of the FBI, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, the Boston Police Department, the Chelsea Police Department, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and everyone said, if anybody finds out that we have informants and we don't give the name of the informants, we're going to blow the cases. I think that's a pretty big incentive not to come forward with the fact that there were informants in this case.
So in this case, the government failed to disclose this information to the defense because?
It could have, since they would have never given away the names of the informants, they would have had to dismiss the cases. I had done that myself about a year earlier in 1966. I understood the Roviaro case very, very well because I used it many successful times.
So if the system had worked correctly in this case, how should the government have handled the information received from its confidential informants?
If they're looking,
what's the way that they should have handled this?
If they're looking for the truth, and you don't want to put someone in prison or to die in the electric chair, do you think that the common decency is that, let me give them this evidence? But if I am bent only on convictions, and I have an agenda that I don't want to share with anybody else, I am looking to hide all the good evidence, conjure and perjure and make up the bad evidence, And let's go with the convictions, because, as has been stated, the witness protection program began with Joseph Barboza. I say it was a misnomer. I say it was the criminal protection program, and it wasn't the witness protection program. When Joe Barboza went out to California under the witness protection program, he killed 3 to 5 more people. He's in the federal witness protection program, and he is killing people in California. As a matter of fact, he goes to trial on a first-degree murder case in 1971 and is still in the witness protection program, and that the head of the organized crime strike force and 2 FBI agents go out to California and help the defense of Barboza in his 44-day trial of a first-degree murder case, but saying he was a good guy and he helped us with crime back here. Mr. Bailey will be able to tell you more about that, because he was going to be a witness out there, and that's what caused, it was said, Barboza to finally plead to second-degree murder while in the federal witness protection program, and gets a sentence, I believe it was 5 to life. And he has killed others, and no one wanted to investigate it. No one wanted to talk about it.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
Sure.
Mr. Garrow, I'm aware of the fact that 2 FBI agents testified in behalf of Mr. Barboza in that capital case. Could you identify them for the record, please?
H. Paul Rico, Dennis Condon.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Garrett, what's really repulsive about the behavior in this case is, before I got elected to Congress, I was the first assistant district attorney in Middlesex County up in Massachusetts. And we take young lawyers, and we take them into the office and train them, basically a training ground, and we teach the ethics of making sure that they balance the enormous power that a prosecutor has with making sure that the police are getting it right, making sure that they always maintain their responsibility for integrity, to disclose exculpatory information, and to get it right. And I know that's the way Mr. Delahunt's office operates, and to see that it can get this bad is just very, very concerning. And again, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to participating with you further.
I hope you gentlemen will be able to be with us for the next panel. We have some interesting testimony coming there as well. Mr. Latourette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Garrett, I just want to go back to Exhibit 11 just to clean up some stuff if I can.